as some of you know, my background's been institutional finance. And what I find really exciting about this industry is I think this is the next 30 years of finance. And today, carbon credits are a broken market. I actually wouldn't even call it a market. It is a bazaar, okay, where you can buy spices, you can buy aluminum, and there's no kind of consistency or rigor. And so one of the things that we think about what's going on today is that, as a broken market, we need rules and rules that have auditability and verifiability at their core. And so our company develops and creates carbon credits. And those carbon credits essentially, because this market doesn't work, the climate market has one arm tied behind its back. And so in commodities markets, when you have high price for a commodity, you get more supply. And that's been happening for 400 years. So this isn't like something novel. And so today, because of the lack of auditability, verifiability, price has not been able to accelerate. Secondarily, the other key factor is that today the carbon credit market is managed by registries, which are mostly not-for-profits, and nothing against them. They started this market, and they've carried us from where it was zero to where we are today. But as we move from cottage industry to institutional market, this is really incumbent on more institutional actors to kind of take the baton and help them get this to the next stage. And so when we think about this carbon credit market, these assets today are stranded assets. And so what do we mean by that? So a registry, as we know them today, Vera Gold Standard, ACR, there's half a dozen of them, probably more. These registries, they create the asset, they custody the asset, they don't do AML KYC, as you would expect for any financial instrument. And also as a custodian of these assets, however, they're not qualified custodians. And so these assets can't be used for collateral, for lending, for structured products. And thus there is zero velocity in this marketplace. And because of the lack of auditability and verifiability, there's also no confidence in this marketplace. But this is a necessary tool of economic return for climate assets. And so what we're about to delve into here is a basis of regulatory oversight, taking existing SROs, self-reporting organizations, for those of you who don't know what that is. So existing SROs, and so they're color coordinated here. So you have your methodologies and your algorithm companies, for simplicity's sake. These are companies that are taking oil and putting it back in the ground, or capping oil wells. And what's the math on that? Same thing with methane, same thing with forestry, same thing with cover crop. So this is the analytics side, the algorithms. Then you have assurance. Today, there are stakeholders called verifiers. Those verifiers, in some instances, are not auditors. Now, if you invest in a public company, that CEO and that CFO, they rely on the auditor because they transfer that risk, and therefore there's someone who has ownership and has skin in the game. The auditor serves that role, and they provide assurance. There's also a role for insurance, which we'll get into in a second. You have the registries. So DTCC is an example of a registry in the securities market. But they're a regulated entity, and they're regulated by FINRA. The other part that we're going to get into with regard to the registry as the issuing entity, when you create an asset in the securities market, there are written supervisory procedures that you follow as far as the process to create that asset, the analysis that goes into that asset, the audit that goes into that asset. And so we very much believe that FINRA, because of their muscle memory, are best situated to manage the compliance and the issuance of these assets, although they are commodities. And I will say that there are examples of joint regulatory ecosystems between the CFTC on the commodity side and FINRA on the on the non-commodity side. Lastly, or sorry, not lastly, banks and prime brokerage, they have a role to play in this because they're providing the debt, they're providing the collateral. They, as qualified custodians regulated by the SEC, are able to provide that oversight on this marketplace. Lastly, you have the CFTC market operations for commodities. So this is a proposal that we have actually received bipartisan support for, and we are going to start to write the legislation for this in DC starting next week. And we believe that this is a major catalyst for nature-based solutions, engineered solutions, to take this arm that's currently tied behind the back and let it loose. So with that, we have three esteemed guests who come from different walks of life. I'll let them explain their walks of life, but really have a tremendous experience and history that they can reflect on what we're doing here. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Monica Medina, Cameron Prell, and David Carpenter. Monica, if you can give us some background on yourself.
Sure. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's fun to talk to a different group of people than I usually talk to, because I think that's the only way we'll fix some of these problems. So I come at this from the government side. I have a long tenure in government. My most recent job was as the Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans, Environment, and Science, and I worked alongside Special Presidential Envoy Kerry, and particularly on the nature-based solution side of climate, trying to drive change, trying to drive impact. Inside the administration, we passed these giant pieces of legislation. Domestically, we have so many tools now that work, and so much federal support for that. And you see that part of the equation off to the races. But unless we can get this carbon credit system, offsets market, however complicated we can make it, unless we can get that to take off, the countries that have a lot to give, that are not big emitters, won't be able to play in this space. And without nature, I will just make my little nature pitch. Without nature, we cannot solve the climate crisis. There is no less expensive, more effective, available today asset to hold on to carbon than a tree, a mangrove. Don't even think it's just forests. There are lots of seagrass. There's blue carbon that's, countries with lots of storage capacity that could grow, or with lots that they're storing now that could be monetized. And without that funding, it's really hamstringing the entire climate discussion, because otherwise all they do is go to the cops and say, we want another fund. And we're running out of ways to fund these funds with government and even MDB sort of funding. So this is essential, and it has to be, in my view, not only national, but international. And I just came from another panel like this one, where about a bunch of government people were talking about, and academics were talking about, how to do industrial policy and capture more emissions. And the head of the International Chamber of Commerce said, we have no global carbon market. There's a bunch of voluntary markets. They're all a mess. Some economists should work on that. Well, they should have, and they should now. Without it, we'll be really hamstrung.
Thanks, Monica. Cameron.
Sure. So thanks for having me, first of all. Yeah, so I've been on this roller coaster ride for 28 years, 25 years to be precise. I was a White House intern. The 1 year was bad to be a White House intern, but it was a good year for me because I was able to work on the Kyoto Protocol and getting the clean development mechanism set up. And I was a law student at the time, so market-based solutions to climate change. I was like, this is where it's going. It's getting right around the corner. As soon as Al Gore becomes president, it'll be the thing. I went to GW, got an international environmental law master's while I was working at the bank, at the World Bank, excuse me. And at the World Bank, I worked on the prototype carbon fund, which was the first fund to establish carbon finance as we know it today, right? In terms of deployment of capital to developing nations. After that stint and setting up the emission reduction purchase and sale agreements as an attorney, I went into law firm practice, and I said sustainable development and climate change was my practice. And they were like, what's that? Like who does that? So I ultimately became an energy lawyer for the next 15 years with a specialty in environmental markets. I helped set up the California market. I helped write the Waxman Markey bill. I helped do transactions in the first Carbon Finance 1.0, Carbon Finance 2.0. You guys probably think of it as 2.0 right now. I'm on like 8.0 for myself. But I also got to learn the financial services sector and all the industrial sectors, particularly the energy sector, as it pertains to emissions and abatement. Somewhere around 2014, I was lucky enough to be working on green bonds and the nexus with digital assets, and specifically an entity called R3, if anybody's familiar with the banking sector. And they mentioned something called non-financial intangible assets, which is not what we now call tokens, right? And that term stuck out to me. Because that's exactly how I had pitched carbon credits to regulators for the first 15 years of my practice, right? So I said, there's got to be some nexus here. And I helped launch a company that is now the largest voluntary carbon market exchange, known as Expansive. I was a general counsel of that for about 5 years. And then recently, past 18 months, have been working with digital platforms to do exactly as Darren's saying, which is to innovate and to actually correct some of the structural and architectural errors in the design of ways that we kind of monetize the environmental attribute associated with these projects. So,
Right. Yeah, thanks, Cameron. David.
David Carpentier, co-founder, CEO of a company called Shirley. It's fascinating, all the chatter about insurance. I'm the insurance person in the room. Thought maybe I was gonna get lynched up here after this last panel. But there's a handful of things we do, but one of our core things is that we work with platforms like Triangle to embed financial products on the inside of these new digital workflows. We span across a handful of industries. Digital assets is a significant industry for us. We actually we're licensed in Bermuda, do a lot through Bermuda as well. Yeah, so that's us. Lots of questions. I'm sure that they'll come out eventually. I'll pause there.
Great. Thanks for that. Let's start with blockchain. Okay. Why blockchain? Why is this the asset that we go up the hill on as far as converting institutional finance using blockchain? Maybe Cameron, why don't you start and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so whenever we're talking about net zero or corporate commitments or even compliance markets, there is a subtext presumption that there's this global scoreboard that people are keeping track of the auditability of the claims, the emissions, and the reductions associated with it. None of that exists, right? And on top of that, the carbon markets, historically speaking, are counterfactual assets, which means that you set a baseline and you achieve an impact, a benefit, or emission reduction subject to that standardized baseline. That is somebody's creation. And so there's a built-in distrust with what that subjective baseline might be, as well as the lack of verifiability in that scoreboard. So blockchain, to your question, is an innovation that creates a decentralized database. Don't worry about it anything other than piping. We don't need to talk about blockchain, but it creates the receipts all the way back to source that allows a project-based activity or a company's activity to be auditable. And that is fundamental to solving some of the ills of the carbon market. Yeah.
Thanks. Monica, you had mentioned nature-based, and obviously you spent a tremendous amount of time with many in the climate industry. And there's a great debate on infrastructure versus a risk management tool like a carbon credit in order to get there. And they think it's either one or the other. How do we navigate this to realize that one doesn't exist without the other? How do we get this community who has the best intentions in the world to realize that maybe the economist is too theoretical and you need market practitioners?
Right. Well, it's interesting because, for so long, we were so focused on reducing emissions. It was just all about mitigation. And now, we have a hurricane barreling down on Florida as we speak, right? Turn into a hurricane today. It's going to be a big one. It looks like you know, the conditions are ripe for this to be a real big problem of a storm. And, you know, we know that we are in the midst of the climate crisis. We don't have the luxury anymore of just worrying about mitigation. We have to do adaptation, and we have to find those solutions that are win-win. And that's the wonderful thing about nature. You plant mangroves, it is storm surge protection. It is a sponge on the coast that will help with all of the adaptation and the, you know, the impacts of climate today, as well as storing a bunch of carbon. But it's hard. People don't think about nature as a solution. They think about it as something nice to have, or, you know, it's fuzzy. We can't do the math on it, back to, you know, traceability or to, you know, accountability for those systems. But the truth is the science is there. What we need to do is actually change the way people think about the overall system that we're trying to create and build it to be as durable as we can in every way.
So, coming back to you, Cameron, real quick. You're active in a number of different working groups on how should these assets be structured. What is the architecture of data versus financial asset? What's the latest that you're hearing in the market today on how those two things are they separate? Are they one and the same? How do they work together? Because all this comes back to this intangible asset is all based on this data.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, no, it's an information-based market. Particularly, it's an information-based market that is subjective according to the standard upon which it's being measured, right? Within that context, and I apologize for getting geeky on you guys for a second, but carbon credits historically have been treated as, like I said, non-financial intangible assets, commodities, right, effectively. And as such, like you have to think about where they are registered, right, where they sit, right? To your point, the registries currently are not custodied entities or custodians. But they do provide a ledger, so to speak. However, like the data that substantiates ultimately the claim that is being retired by a carbon credit is not the asset. Right? It is the data that substantiates the asset, right? And so what transacts is actually some sort of intangible box that you put this data inside, right? And so the data itself is not the commodity. Commodity is what moves that information, right? Or is a representation of that substantiating data. And I'm part of a working group with the UNIDROIT and the UNCITRAL and the United Nations to establish that legal character and nature of the carbon credit itself for this very reason, is because data historically in most jurisdictions doesn't have property rights. As an intangible box, which does have property rights, we have to align the legal jurisdictions and the disciplines in a way that allows the market to transact in that information. That being said, like there is a movement afoot with the digital assets to create the next layer, which is the financial instruments that tie to those intangible boxes, and that's where things really start to get unlocked, so to speak, in terms of securitization, collateralization. Ultimately, that returns back to verifiable, auditable information that is substantiating the intangible asset itself. So sorry for the lawyer question or answer rather.
So that's actually really important because, you know, we talked about a lack of velocity in this asset class and creating that financial unit that can now be structured, lent against, collateralized, et cetera. David, assurance and understanding the methodology is one part of this, and we will have assurance on the screen shortly. And so when we think about this uncertainty of this asset, how does insurance play a role? How do we think about sovereign risk, wildfire risk? Because ultimately these assets are going to be used against their carbon footprint in order to get their lower borrowing cost, which Peter spoke about earlier. So maybe speak to that, your experience in the space, and how are you kind of crafting insurance for the carbon credit market?
Yeah, I'd be honest, and there's been pain felt here. It's a challenge. It's a challenge at a big level. You have an industry that is littered with corporate innovators' dilemma. where we've talked a lot about this industry. Where's the data set, right? Who has access to it? And how do you use it? Insurance is a really interesting industry because we're in the industry of selling trust, but inherently the insurance industry isn't trusted. A fundamental issue. It's the truth, right? And so the challenge here is around aligning incentives with this data, right? We've taken the approach of, we know that a lot of the data is not, data integrity in the insurance industry is a challenge. It is a challenge in a lot of industries, but it is a big overhead cost for us. Where we've taken the approach is technical term, we say aligning ourselves with the adults in the room, right? Working with the triangles of the world and the various stakeholders, and to a certain extent, underwriting the people that these projects are using, underwriting, I'm gonna give you an example outside of this industry in a second, underwriting the things around it that presumably you can make some really strong assumptions that the risk is gonna be mitigated. But here's a real life example for us. Let's take a step backwards. So we chase a lot of vertical SaaS. So basically you have industries that are adopting technology, and the acceleration of that adoption is where we really like to play. Ironically, where there's a ton of acceleration in software adoption is in building homes, particularly custom homes. So randomly, there's insurance companies that we are just funneling, we're basically quoting and binding policies, 100% programmatic, 100% APIs. And the insurance companies don't want to use our lat long data. They don't want to go down to that level of detail because there's an inconvenience for them around their processing. It seems super simple, but I can give them the exact latitude, longitude down to, I think, like 10 decibels, right? Like something insane on what parts of the project. They don't want it. They want to do it by county, right? So that therefore, now we talk about, the hurricanes and whatnot. I can get within 5 miles of the coast from an underwriting perspective if the insurance company allows me to transfer that risk. But they're like, no, we're just going to shut it off at this county, which we're talking 30, 40 miles off the coast. So it's a long-winded way of saying if you go in the papers and yell disrupt, you're going to get blackballed from the industry. And so how do you work through the four walls of these institutions? Put your arms around people, get them comfortable. I remember, we've known each other for a while. Try launching a insurance product, ensuring basically around capital raising, leveraging blockchain technology in 2016, going into 2017 when ICOs went bananas, right? And then there's the STO and all this stuff. And literally it was an education. I think one of the panelists was talking about educating folks, right? It's an education around getting these folks comfortable with the first principles of what you're actually doing and saying, hey, look, there's some players in the room. These aren't cavalier folks. So apologize for a long-winded way, but it is a challenge. I mean, you got to pick your battles and understand that it's not going to happen all overnight. It's a big industry that doesn't have a lot of incentives to change.
So just one footnote, then we're going to open up for a couple questions here. At COP26 in Glasgow, when we were there, this is when I heard this for the first time, and kind of speaks to the insurance industry and the challenges that they're facing. So insurance prices year to year. And so climate change, because climate is 2 years forward, does not equate into the insurance. Now, that is since changing, but speaks to even as recently as 2 years ago, that was the mentality.
Yeah. And we're changing. And again, AI is not going to be a silver bullet for everything. Here, let's just be very clear on this, particularly the use cases today. People want to talk about, okay, AI is going to basically solve this whole situation. Let's talk about immediate use cases, right? I have $1 that I'm selling a product for right now, 53 cents of its use for risk capital. That's insane, right? 47 cents is going out the door to somebody, right? A lot of that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of manual processes in the back end. Literally last night at about 10 o'clock, I chopped off about 30% of my staff, which is a really unfortunate thing to say in public, because I'm moving them to AI agents. I'm processing a lot. So like, these are the things that we're going to chip away with it. That being said, we talk about, and I know Ray probably left because people are going to start asking him for money. But some of the insurance like concepts, like there will be AI applications to that, but it's not silver bullet. It's going to be that Venn diagram of solving for data, solving for distribution, solving for intelligence, and then creating some type of incentive to move it in that direction. I know we talked a lot about pause here because nobody really wants to hear from an insurance guy. But your projects are going to go 3 years before the assets are retired, sometimes 10 years, right? And insurance policies are on an annual basis. How the hell do you price that into what we're doing here?
Yeah.
Right. And so that was something where you just have to kind of take a step back. What's the first principle we're really trying to get accomplished? And then get the insurance company on board with that in an intelligent, soft, thoughtful way.
So let's open it up to a couple questions real quick. Yeah.
This is for Cameron. Why does it have to be new? I mean, I guess one of the questions I have is that, if you look at VCOs, they function a lot like EWRs or like the LME sword system, right? And in that case, you have no one's actually inspecting the aluminum that's held all over the world. You have the LME sword system. There's refiners all over the world, and people trust through that process that what is created can be freely traded without a lot of verification once it enters the system. It seems like a system like that, or any of the other exchanges actually would work fairly well here. Like, why is there a lot of focus on creating something new for this, newish product?
Largely because of the way it was originally created. So the history of voluntary space, I assume that you're referring to, is that it was the results of some of the, let's just say, learnings of the CDM of Kyoto. And so these non-governmental organizations, VCS at the time, now known as Vera, launched a version of the CDM Secretariat, right, which was a centralized entity that you had to get your methodology approved, your standards approved, and you had to go through that whole process as they set it up, right? Long-winded way of saying is that the market is structured for bottlenecks. It's not structured in a financial accounting, decentralized, accredited assurance methodology approach, right? And so there are several standards that you have to effectively work through them to get to a point where you get issuance of your claim, which is the carbon credit, instead of having an accredited verifier on his own, going out and verifying that, yes, a claim, an achievement of a reduction or an impact was correct according to the standard. Off you go to the local bank, and you can register that asset in some fashion. That ideally would have been how they started, because to your point, that would be more like any other market that exists today in the commodity space. That's not how it started, and so that's why the architecture of the voluntary carbon market is its own worst enemy, right? In that way. Yeah.
Can I jump in too and just say, the problem with people like me is we are not economists. Like we know how to think about solving for climate on a sort of, with industrial policy or whatever. We don't make markets very well. We don't really think that way. We think about, okay, how are we going to solve the carbon problem? But we don't really think about how to create a market with what in our outcome is in mind. So just as he said, they sort of said, well, we'll just figure all that out later. We'll just sort of slide it to the left, and if we get started, it'll all work itself out. But I actually, in my current life, created a cap and trade system for fish, if you can believe it, for fishing for fish. The problem was it was a bunch of fish biologists who made it, and what they said was, we don't really care how many people own the shares in this fishery. And so one guy got them all, and he turned out to be corrupt as all get out. And so the whole thing collapsed and all this, so there's more than just creating even an ability to have a thing that you can, and there was no transparency in this market. So the fishermen traded under the table. Nobody, and the agency said, well, we don't care what it costs, as long as we know that X number of fish are going to get caught, which of course was impossible to verify again, because we had no other standards in this market. So we thought if we just cap it, and they can just do whatever they want among themselves, it'll all be fine. And it was so simplistic. And, you know, from the biologist's perspective, it was fine because we were solving for the fish number that we needed. And before that, all we had was days at sea effort, right? So like we'd say, okay, everybody go out and fish. And when we thought we had as many fish as they were supposed to catch in, you know, in port, landed, we cut it off. But nobody could plan that way. Nobody knew, you know, how many days would they have? So everybody went out and raced and caught as many fish as they could. So then we ended up with not enough fish. The same thing can happen here. We think we've created a market when we really haven't. We've just created a bunch of things that are not worth much now, but need to be worth more, because otherwise we're leaving value on the table.
That's right. And just one other thing, you know, if I have a ton of aluminum or a ton of steel or an ounce of gold, people can see that.
I mean, no one looks.
I hear you, but no one looks because there's a history of people trusting it. In this market, there is a history of people not trusting it. And because the intangible nature of this asset, inherently, you need to solve for that confidence shortfall. Because if you don't solve for the confidence shortfall, the market will not work. One more question, and then we got to get to the next panel. Sorry for being the time Nazi.
Oh, Darren, you gave us some insight before, and you're quite optimistic that in fact, U.S. regulators, government officials will recognize carbon credits as financial instruments soon?
Yes, I did.
Perfect.
Can I just add that too? I worry that there are too many naysayers out there, and it will spook these folks. And we don't have time.
Yeah.
We just don't have time. We need everybody in this room to be all in on it. There are too many articles out there saying these things are baloney. They're never going to work. You know, they shouldn't be doing this, blah, 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 blah. And all that happens is, you know, we just sow our own fate, right? And it's not good.
So I have one last question before we move on. 2030, 2040, what is your price target on average for carbon credits?
Oh, God.
It's a tough one.
Writing this
Cameron,
down.
you start.
Yeah, I got an easy answer. I answer this quite often. There may be a global carbon price, highly unlikely, right? What you're going to have is a smattering of different types of carbon prices, right? Depending on the financial instrument, depending on the sector, depending on how it's correlated to a product, to an asset, to a company, right? But then the second piece of this is that there's two different ways of looking at that question. The historical one is an economist view, which is like over time as climate change proceeds and gets worse and worse and worse, then the risks increase, the cost of abatement will go up, which is known as the DICE model, right? But then there's the financial asset valuation approach, which is called easy climate, which is right now the value of carbon itself is high. It's an asset of negative expected return, and that over time it's going to go down. So to answer your point, 2030 is probably right around that strike, right? In that way. So ultimately, depending on the success of the ability to reform and improve these markets, probably somewhere between 150 and 300 in that neighborhood.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah.
Somewhere between 150 and 300 per ton. Yeah,
2040,
yeah, 2030.
moment 2040.
2040, yeah, it really depends on regulatory issues. That's the overhang, is that like somewhere along the lines, governments using their positive law enforcement are going to come in and regulate and command and control. And so the longer we push this out, paradoxically, the more expensive it gets, right, from a command and control perspective for costs, just in terms of market engagement and investment. So yeah, that's the wild card. That's why I'm always putting caveats as to that price.
Monica,
I'd be so happy if it was 100. I mean, really, honestly, that would just be an amazing thing. And what I worry about being, government again, is the fact not only is there an election in this country, there's elections in so many countries around the world. And so the uncertainty about the governance models and whether we actually make the progress we need to in the midst of all of this shifting around and people being uncertain. See, the average consumer just sees their insurance going up, right? They don't really connect the dots and they're mad. And so if they kick out all the people who are trying to do the right things, I worry.